So Shabbat Shalom. How's everybody this morning? Okay, so today, I was just informed that it's a double portion, but luckily for me, I read the other ones too. So we'll start out in Leviticus 12. So, and this one is talking about need a rest for new mothers. What are we thinking?
I retitled it maternity leave.
God's maternity leave plan?
Yeah.
Yeah? Is it better than the one that you get at your job in modern times?
At a lot of places, yeah. So, but yeah, that's kind of where I looked. I thought that's where the idea of maternity leave came from.
Truly, there is nothing new under the sun, is there? Right? We like to think that we come up with all this new and modern stuff, but what has all been done before. There's really nothing new under the sun. Maybe the cell phone, but even I have my doubts about that, to be honest with you. Okay, so yeah, in chapter 12, it basically, like you said, is dealing with sort of maternity leave, but I remember reading this years ago and sort of looking at it maybe a little bit negatively with all this having to be separated, coming away from the camp and no touching and, unclean and all of this kind of language that went along with this. But it's true for those of you in the audience or people watching on YouTube. One of our elders, Tom Blake, did an awesome teaching on this. I would not be able to tell you what the date that he did it. It was a while ago, maybe last year at this time, possibly. It would be on YouTube. Anyway, he did a fantastic teaching on this subject, and really how this was God's way of really caring for women after childbirth. And it wasn't like they were separated and were still required to take care of all the duties of a mother and a wife, but that she was given a break. What do we got here? 33 and 66 days, depending. Where during that time, she was actually cared for by her family and by the community, and was given a rest. So it wasn't. There wasn't anything really negative or bad about this part. That was really the only thing that I would touch on, that I felt like I would touch on in that. Chapter 13. I like the way that this is titled, and this is actually where I kind of want to spend most of my time with you guys, if we're okay. We'll see where the discussion leads. But so in the TLV, chapter 13 is Tsarat, supernatural skin disease. Why do you think it's calling it a supernatural skin disease?
Well, one thing that comes to mind is that Miriam was struck with leprosy, wasn't she, for speaking out against Moses.
Right.
So it was like a judgment. That's just a thought.
Yeah, we were kind of talking about it on our way over here this morning, my mom and me and the kids, and she had brought that up too, as well as Moses. Moses' hand was struck with leprosy, and then immediately turned around and cured. But the sign that had happened to him was there. The sign that he had experienced this leprous episode, he was stricken by God, really, and healed. So, and that was supposed to be one of the signs that he would be able to give as proof that he had been dealing with the Lord and that the Lord had chosen him. to be his appointed spokesman and the hand that he would use to bring Israel out of Egypt. So I'm going to go to one of my questions. So it is assumed that the afflicted person is guilty of sin and has been judged, is it assumed that the afflicted person is guilty of sin and has been judged or punished by God? What do you think?
Sounds kind of like a double whammy.
How so?
Well, you get the skin disease and everybody says it's your fault. But you can't win.
It's not like in the, many of our translations, besides this one where it calls it leprosy, it's not true leprosy.
Right.
But it does refer to it as a plague in this, that the individual person has a plague. And of course, when you think of plagues, you think of the judgment of the Lord on something, like they just went through the plagues in Egypt. So you label something plague, I'm sure in their mind they're thinking there's some kind of judgment going on.
Right.
But I think for most of this, it's once again has to just do with clean and unclean, not necessarily sin-based. I mean, so many things, you know, when somebody gets a staph infection or gets some kind of infection, so many of those things are out of your control. So to label somebody who's ill being of sin, you have to be so careful of that, because that even translates over now. What did that person do wrong, that they have cancer, or that this happened or that happened?
Mm-hmm.
And that's totally between that person and God. To label that person as being a sinner because they're sick,
Right.
is, yeah. I think this has more to do with the spreading of it rather than the separation in them. You know, the same way like if somebody has a staph infection, because they keep talking about boils, so I'm thinking of things like highly contagious.
Were you a
disease.
nurse? Or?
No, but I've been around enough sick people.
Okay.
And when you see that type of thing, it is contagious. And so I always kind of view this more as they're looking at this as, is this something that could spread to the community?
Right.
Rather, that's why they keep getting checked to see if it's a spreading disease. Because it's all about keeping the community healthy, safe, and clean so they can go into the tabernacle.
You touched on a lot of different subjects, which
Yeah.
is great, because I want to go there with some of this, some of the modern thinking versus what we're coming to understand as 1st and 2nd century thinking, or maybe ancient thinking about these matters. I forget who it was that taught it. It may even been Rabbi Jerry years ago, but I'm recalling we're offered a caution in this, and I'm not saying this to contradict what you're saying, but we're offered a caution in this, like I said, if I'm remembering the teaching right. We were really dealing primarily with spiritual things, and there's a tendency to take the Torah commandments in regards to these things and try and look at them through a scientific lens and be like, oh, this is really about health, like, or about public health. And I'm not saying that it isn't, because clearly it seems like that there's evidence to show that it is. Right, we're not wanting this thing to spread throughout the camp. I don't want to lose my train of thought, but you think about 1 million plus people camping in close proximity to each other. This could be a problem. Contagious and diseases and sicknesses spreading could very well be a problem, but that isn't really so much what this is dealing with. Like I said, if I'm remembering what the teaching was about, was for us to be careful when we look at these type of things, like I'll bring into it eating kosher, keeping kosher, right? So my family does, we do, but now over the years, I've heard people talk about how bad pork is, right? Oh, well, the reason why God didn't want the children of Israel to eat pork was because it's bad for you. It's got worms. It does, it's really an unhealthy food. The eating of this, scavenger ocean creatures, right? The bottom feeders and all that are basically eating, poop from fish and dead fish and things like that. Like, oh, it's not really. Science has said, there's some unhealthy things about that, and so people will tend to make like a transfer, like, oh, God was revealing these things before there was scientific, thought about it, or so on and so forth. And so, like I said, if remembering the teaching correctly, we're cautioned about that. That this is, I'm not saying that there's not some truth to those things, but that isn't primarily what was being dealt with here. Okay, so I don't know if any of you guys have heard any of this before. I'm seeing some nodding heads. Yeah. So okay, my original train of thought along the lines with what Laurie, you were bringing out, the stigma. I wanted to talk a bit about that, the stigma that would go along with this. Saying that if someone has an illness or a sickness, that it's because they did something wrong. They sinned, they deserved it, it's punishment from God. What do we think about that in relation to what it is that we've read here? What do you say, Emma? You're a Leviticus expert.
I don't know about that, but I mean, I think this is an interesting thing because I don't know that it says, unless I'm just not remembering. I did read it this week, but I also read a lot of other things. I don't know that it says that it's Adonai that causes this. Now, of course, we're kind of bringing in the examples of the times that we do know that Adonai inflicts us, and I'm not saying that doesn't apply here.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just suggesting that not every time there's something that there's this type of skin disease, whatever it may be, is not always a punishment from God. It seems very clear the times that it is. It seems very clear that it's God doing it, and why. And other times I think it's just you don't know, and I do think I think it's reasonable to assume that if a person has this type of affliction, they're probably doing some searching of their hearts, and they do have to, to kind of be restored back once it's gone. They have to bring sacrifices, and there has to be some restored order.
And there's specific sacrifices, which is something we're going to touch on too.
Yeah. So I don't think it's always nothing, and I don't think it's always this massive sin issue. I think that it's one of those areas that it's hard, that it's just, part of it is kind of like along with what you were saying, is that part of it is God saying, if this is an issue, then you don't go in the tabernacle and you do have to separate yourself. Which is a hard thing, right? Like you have to be separated from your community for 7 days or however long it takes for this disease to go away. And
maybe even permanently.
Yeah, and that's hard. It's not a small thing. But again, that's where I always like to make the distinction of us being really careful to not, because it does say it makes the person unclean, which means they can't go into the tabernacle, and it does mean they have to be careful with their contact with other people who are going to be going into the tabernacle. But it doesn't always equal sin. We have to make sure we keep breaking that connection in our brains between unclean and sin, because they're not the same thing. They can be connected, but they're unclean and sin are not synonymous terms.
So what you're saying, and like most things, we wanna be careful with the blanket statements, right, or the blanket
Yeah.
assumptions. It must be this. How many, go ahead, Lori.
Well, I was gonna say, with the unclean, I mean, right from the get-go, Aaron was told to teach the people what's holy and not holy, what's clean and unclean. So this chapter right before it, this woman had this baby. While she's menstruating, while she's bleeding, she's classified as unclean. She hasn't sinned. And again, they're using that word. They're not saying this person has sinned. They're saying this person is unclean. And a lot of things, bodily fluid, whatever, that's out of your control. But you're still unclean. You can't go into, if he's holy and he's here in the midst of you and he wants to reside in the midst of you, then you need to be clean to go in before him. And it was Aaron's job to teach the people when they were clean and when they were unclean, and how not to pollute the community with their uncleanness. Because somebody else dies and I'm in their presence, it's not my fault they died, but all of a sudden I'm unclean. So we still have this people surrounding us can make us unclean too. And we want people, the Lord just wants some clean people in the presence to be able to be there. And so, again, Aaron's just trying to teach these people when your body's clean and when your body's not clean before the Lord.
Well said. Got a couple of hands back there.
Okay, you're on first.
I was thinking in different ways. Today, we just went through a big plague of COVID. And if you contacted COVID, then you had to separate yourself. So there was those. Here, it first is 7 days, just to see how the disease progresses, whether it's actually Samarat, which is different from any other skin disease. With the woman who just gave birth, it's for her protection. She needs time to heal. Her body needs time to go back to a natural form, so then she can proceed with her usual marriage life. So it's different things that take place, but the biblical language is clean or unclean, which doesn't mean that the person has done a grievous sin or spoken against God or spoken against another person. It just simply means this body needs to be separated because it needs time to heal. And we need to find out what it is. Of course, with the pregnant woman, it's obvious she was in a state of bearing a child, and so it's different for her. But she still needs to be separated so that her body doesn't contact something from another person that will be injurious to her body and her baby. So, a lot of this is also a protection plan. We live in a fallen world. We can get contaminated from different things in the soil, the air around us. So the nation of Israel was not in the land that God had given to them. They were in a land that was different from even Egypt, because in Egypt, God kept them protected from different things. If you look at their time in Egypt, they aged, but they weren't sick. They had to work. So there was a protection there. Outside of Egypt, they're going through different lands that people live differently, they need protection. So if for some reason once they, before they went into the promised land, they were in a place where they could contact whatever things are there. They needed protection, they needed isolation, not just for their own good, but from the good of the community.
Okay.
So, just my mind goes to different things. You take what happened in the old time versus what happens in our own time that we live in. We contact all kinds of different things. We don't have high priests to go to, we go to doctors. But, just that kind of thing.
We still have a high priest, the high priest. Miss Faith?
I was kind of thinking that it's, to me, what comes to mind is a picture, number one, of our absolute need of God, that we are completely of a sinful nature. Whether we do something intentionally or not, we are in need of being a new creation. And when we see Yeshua coming in and healing the lepers and those who are separated from others, it's like every one of us has that need, whether it manifests in blindness, spiritual blindness, or being lame, or all these things that he touched. So I think it's a lesson in, if we continue on in our sin, we are gonna contaminate the camp. And we need to be isolated, we need to be separated. And that's really what God is doing, and I think establishing his kingdom. Because now's the time to deal with, like Ellen talked about, examining ourselves. If somebody comes our way like, wow, is there something going on with me, Lord, that I need to deal with? Like Passover, we just went through that. Really self-examination, is there anything in me that would be harmful to others? So that's where I go.
I like that. Self-examination is something that I feel like we should always be doing. And so I want to bring this question. So let's be real. I'm not saying that we haven't been. I'm saying let's be real. How many of us have gotten really, really sick or hurt really, really bad? And that question comes to mind. God, why are you doing this to me? Why did this happen to me? And where do we go with that? So, without the camera turning around, by a show of hands, how many people have ever done that? Something bad happens to you, you get really, really sick, something happens to a loved one. God, why are you doing this? Not even necessarily why did you allow this to happen? Why are you doing this? And where does that come from? So I will raise my hand in agreement with all the other people, which was mostly everybody. Okay? What's up with that?
It's human nature. We have a desire to understand. We need to understand. We need to have it explained to us. And when that doesn't happen, we take the easiest explanation, which isn't necessarily the correct one.
Okay.
If I can't think anything else, well, then you sin.
Yeah, but we're a modern scientific people
No, we're not.
here. Okay, it was a little sarcasm. We're a modern scientific people. We have doctors and CAT scans and MRIs and blood work and all that other stuff, right? We have all that.
The same as we've been for 5,000 years or more.
Mentally.
So viscerally, it's in us, right? There's this recognition of sort of the supernatural, that no matter how scientific, no matter how enlightened, whatever, pick your word, we go there.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that it's just believers. Nassim, you've raised your hand?
Yeah, I have to follow up on what Lori said, that Aaron has to inspect the people to be real clean, to be able to go into the Holy of Holies. But there is a problem there, because a person that has nothing to do with him being clean or not, let's say he was born with no pinky toe, he's not allowed to go into the Holy of Holies. And they claim that God's rule is that you have to be pure all the way. But God created me with no pinky toe, now I'm not allowed to go to the Holy of Holies. This
Well,
is a
unless you were the
tremendous-
high priest, you would never be going into the Holy of Holies anyway,
What?
but I said unless you were the high priest, you wouldn't be going into the Holy
I
of Holies
understand.
anyway. But you're talking about going into the holy place, right?
Yeah, when it comes to leprosy, because it was a visually very ugly, very nasty look of, and then they claim it on the behavior of the person, the reason why he got this leprosy. There's no evidence of anything because they didn't have science like we have today, and to know where the disease come from. They invented all kind of assumptions. Oh, okay, he got the leprosy, this ugly disease. We have to quarantine him, separate him, because he sinned, and the reason he got it was he sinned against God. And they were rushed to judgment, and I think the wisdom of the writing, okay, for us in a modern time to look at that like we were there at that time, to find out that it is invention of the individuals and to blame God in all those things, you know?
So you're kind of crossing between sort of what the text is talking about, the assumptions that we're talking about here, right? That various people have brought up, right? We make some blanket assumptions. Even the question we ask ourselves, God, why did you do this to me? Why did you let this happen to me? Why is this happening?
Right, and I don't think, as we know God, as the honesty of Him, and His justice and everything, He will create someone without a pinky toe, and this someone so much wants to go and to be holy like everybody else, but he is not allowed to because God created him with no pinky toe.
Great.
Nothing on his own fault.
Mm-hmm.
And God doesn't work that way, in my opinion.
Okay.
So it's probably invention of some priests that were power free.
I think that's pointing to the fact that we need Yeshua, who is the perfect, spotless one,
Thank you.
who is our substitute, and nobody comes in but through him. So he's the one who is perfect and perfects us, because if we don't have a missing pinky toe, we got something else going on, that just by virtue of our humanity. So that's what I would say.
It's true. Again, we can go places and make assumptions about things, but they are just that in a lot of ways. But all right, so how can we use what we know or what we have of Bible history to explore some of that? So let's come out of the Old Testament for just a minute and go into the New Testament. Per man born blind from birth, or right, is blind from birth, wants to be healed. Lord, who sinned, him or his parents, that he's this way? Was the question that was asked, right? And what was Yeshua's response?
Neither.
Could you say that again louder?
Neither.
Neither. And did he offer any other context besides just saying neither?
So that the glory of the Lord could be shown in the midst of that healing.
So that God would be glorified
Mhm.
by what is going to happen here. Well, we can look at that in a couple of ways. We can look at that sort of as a blanket statement that would address Nassim's born without a pinky toe, or born without a pinky, would fall under that blanket statement. Or we could say, well, it was just that one guy. That one guy was born that way so that this miracle could happen, so that Yeshua, demonstrating the power of God through him, could be put here. So we would have it to see later. What do you think? Just the one guy? Or are we okay with using, or do we feel comfortable in saying, maybe it's helpful for us to look at that perspective a little bit more, like the guy born without the pinky or the pinky toe, that God has some other purpose? Susan?
I think one of the things that you alluded to, but didn't quite go to, was the base of, do we believe that God is good?
Mm-hmm.
Do we believe that to every extent? And when we can get to that core issue, the question may change. Because even with when Moses, the leper, he gave him it, but then he took it away.
Mhm.
Because he was showing, even in these things, I can heal, the power of who he is. So it's taking a look at the bigger picture of God. And being able to come to that place of, even, you can see so many times, all of them, and they go back, they go through this, why God, why God, why God? But yet, you are the true living God. And when we get to that place, and we know that he is good, then somehow he can start to change our perspective and show us the part of our heart that he's trying to perfect or bring out or show to not just ourselves, but maybe even to many.
Right.
So, since that question was asked of Yeshua, who sinned, and he answered that question, I don't believe it was for one isolated situation. I believe that so much of when Yeshua was walking the earth, he was correcting misinterpretations and misperceptions of who the Lord is and what he's doing, because it seemed like he was constantly addressing legal precedents that had been morphed into something more, and he was trying to bring it back to the heart of the Father on so many things. So the fact that this had become the mindset that anytime somebody was crippled, or anytime somebody, either their parents sinned or they sinned, and he was addressing this and saying, no, neither of them did. And I think that was put in there so that we could, they could stop, and we could stop that perception that somebody had to have done something wrong for this to happen.
Did it stop it?
No.
No, because in this day and age, there's still that. Like, I have a
We
friend.
still, yes.
Yeah, I have a friend that has a handicapped child, and she has still had people coming up going, well, it must have been a hidden sin of the parents that this child was born this way. And this woman has received those kind of accusations, which are so hurtful and so wrong. And so we still have this mindset that we have to be able to figure out why it's this
We
way.
need that explanation.
Yeah, and we don't, I mean, but I think it immediately goes to a human mind that when something isn't right, we have to figure out who's to blame. Whether it's God or it's the person, but somebody's to blame,
Mhm.
rather than just looking at the fact that sometimes things happen.
Brad?
Well, first, in talking about the blind man, I was reminded of Paul, because God did strike him with blindness and then took it away to show his glory, but also to use a physical malady in order to redirect our attention to a spiritual reality.
Well said.
And I'm reminded too of the paralyzed man that was lowered through the roof in Luke 5, and then Yeshua said, "Friend, your sins are forgiven." And then the Pharisees are all up in arms. Who is this man who speaks blasphemies and God alone forgives? And he says, "Why are you thinking this in your hearts? Which is it easier to say your sins are forgiven, or to say get up and walk? But so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." He told the paralyzed man, "I tell you, get up, take your stretcher, and go home." And so I think, once again, he uses the reality. Our focus should be on God and on the spiritual reality, and on the reality of heaven. But we as humans tend to get mired in the physical, in our physical ailments and maladies. But what do? Even, I think God, I mean, this is me putting words in God's mouth, but would rather have us turn to him and say, "Why, God?" Because then at least we're talking to him. Then at least we're opening a dialogue. Even if it's to blame him, we're at least opening that dialogue, whereas before we might have been just going about our lives, not even thinking about him, but now that something has afflicted me, now I'm turning to him, and now I've turned my face to God, and now he has access to talk to me now that I've turned back to him.
Well said.
Mhm.
Right, so the wisdom here is it one or the other? Yeah. Could be one or the other, right? But the bottom line is, where should we turn for help? Where should be the first place that we should go for help, right? So when I'm looking at this and all of the prescribed rites and the things that had to go on, right? The inspection, right? Someone has, you know, a defect on their skin or something's going on, and there's like a stigma that goes along with that. Can you imagine after going through all this, and then as you've read through the chapters, like what are the other things that has to happen? The person's outside the camp, right? They're removed from the community. Stigma. They have to keep separate from everybody else. Even you can't go to the temple, or can't go to the tabernacle. Got to get inspected by a stranger. The high priest or the priest or whoever it is, Aaron or one of his sons, has got to come and be, inspecting your body, inspecting these wounds. The fear, the doubt, all of the emotions that would probably be involved in all that. Then, even upon being pronounced clean, what happens? You get to shave your whole body, eyebrows and everything. Couple of public baths, not baths like in front of everybody or whatever, but all this washing and all this other stuff that goes on. And then sacrifices that have to be made. And they're not just any sacrifice. It's a trespass offering and a sin offering. Even though it could have been, what? The person didn't do anything wrong, right? They ended up with something that they noticed and they brought it to the attention of the priest, and like they were supposed to, right? Hey, I got this thing on my arm. Can you look at it? Okay, all this stuff's got to happen. Whether again it was because they did something unintentionally or intentionally, or it's just a fallen world, right? Things happen. Regardless, they have to go through all of these things in there, so that there would be that. For us, we're looking at it like there's a stigma attached to it. But would they see it in the same way? Or should we see it in the same way? If we're going under the premise that God is good and that he's good all the time, then where can we find his goodness in this? I'm seeing a lot of Mom?
This Sarah thing, it didn't happen just to human beings. It was also seen in garments, fabrics, leather, even clay pots. So, and the thing is, if your garment, then you went and you did what the high priest said and treated it that way. If it doesn't go away, then the garment has to be burned.
Mm-hmm.
If a clay pot, you did what you were told to do, wash it, scrape it, whatever, and it kept coming back, the house. So there was something in the land that produced these microorganisms or whatever that would have this effect. It just showed that although the people had God's protection, they were still able to contact this thing. So obviously it came from the environment. Not that God didn't have a way of dealing with it, he did. And the process of God dealing with it was shown in the process that the high priest had to take. The separation, the days, 7, 14, even more, until it was proven what it was. If it couldn't be taken care of through what you did, then it had to be burned. Thank God, when people got it in their bodies, they didn't have to be burned, but they had to be separated. So there's something in the environment. The land has been cursed. And we can see that in other scriptures, in other places where the land is cursed. It will not produce. So it was God's way of showing us how he deals with a world that he created. How it was in the Garden of Eden versus outside of the Garden of Eden. Genesis goes through all that. Conditions.
I hadn't
Where
thought
do we
of the
turn when we
environmental.
come in this place of either having this done to our garments or my saddle or whatever, how it gets, carried over, and how the bed becomes contaminated, the garments become contaminated, anybody else who touches becomes contaminated, and they have to go through a separation process. So, it's marvelous. Today we have medical science to deal with pretty much the same things, but at that time, this is how God dealt with it. And these were his instructions for dealing with whatever comes your way. So, then there was a process. Today there is a process. You take antibiotics or ointments or whatever. With COVID, you had to be separated. Was there a cure? So far there hasn't been a cure for COVID. But you still have to go through the process. And we'll be facing a lot more than COVID as the end times progress forward. So we have to see God's hand in everything. The answer is still, don't depart yourself from God. Get closer and see what he does. He may heal miraculously, that he did, like he did the blind man and the crippled man and so many others, the woman with the issue of blood. In everything that happens, there is looking to God, because he created us. He created the earth. He created the world. He is going to one day bring everything back to perfection. But he's always in the picture. It's not like I've never been sick. I've cried to my Father in heaven. Heal me. Not just because I want to be healed, but I have family. I have a community. I don't want to be separated. But there are times when, you have to stay home because you have to look towards your community that you don't want to. So, it's a learning process. If we go to the Word of God first, we get an education. We can go to college, we can go to, whatever, and get a lot more, but the foundation for us is still the Word of God, bottom line.
Ultimately, when you jump ahead to Leviticus 15, when we get all these, I have a real hard time every time I read the laws or the unclean, where they had to go around but it was obviously something super serious here. Like, if you had to make sure that nobody was sneaking around with this disease and infecting other people or infecting other things. So it seemed harsh for somebody to cover their lip. I keep thinking, when you're sick, you cover your mouth, right? So you're not spreading it. And they had to cover their lip and say, unclean, unclean. Embarrassing, yes. Protecting the rest of the community, yes. When you get, though, to chapter 15, in verse 31, so you are to keep Bnei Israel separated from their uncleanness, so that they will not die in their uncleanness by defiling my tabernacle that's in their midst. So when we go through all of this stuff on the uncleanness, basically it comes back down to, you want God to dwell in your midst. You cannot be defiling his tabernacle. He is in your midst, and you want him there. So this is what we need to do for him to stay in the center of the camp. And he's given you a way for him to dwell with you. Because they still have all the illusions of what it looked like when Adam and Eve were cast out from that. And now God's finally wanting to dwell with his people, but there are guidelines to that for him to be in their midst, and these are part of the guidelines. You want him there, let's do it his way. Let's stay clean.
You know, we human beings have to be careful that we're not offended by God. You know, he's God.
Yeah.
We're offended. He's become a stumbling block to us. Like, who are we?
Go ahead.
Well, I do think it's of utmost importance, like what you were saying, Susan, that we always know that God is good, He is perfect, He is completely righteous, and everything He does is for our good. And even all these examples we have in the natural are always pointing to a spiritual, I believe. And again, back to, this is our human condition. We need God. We cannot make it one day, not being overwhelmed by our adversary and all the ways he would try to trip us up, if not for God. And anyway, so yes, that's our human condition, and I believe, yeah, we must always know he is perfect. He never does anything in an imperfect way.
So a question, wasn't even one of the ones that I wrote down. I have 2 pages worth of them here. We got to 2. Are we looking at all of these things as burdensome?
Burdensome.
Yes.
I'm not sure I understand what you mean.
So it's not like he says, okay, well, go to the doctor, see the doctor, and the doctor's gonna give you something. It's go and show yourself, go outside of the camp. The priest has to come outside of the camp to meet you there because you can't be in the camp. He's gotta examine you. Then you gotta wait 7 days, and you gotta kind of sit in that for 7 days. And he's gotta come back again, and he's gotta re-examine you. Then there's this process. If this, then this is what happens. If that, then that's what happens. Then there's, like I said, there's these cleansing and the sacrifices involving pigeons and, what is it? Hyssop, cedar wood, clean water, or living water, right?
So,
Shaving your whole body, washing your clothes, washing yourself before you can present yourself back to, again, back to the priest, and then be able to go into the tabernacle again. You see, this is burdensome.
do we see it as burdensome? Is that burdensome, is that the same thing as inconvenient, or burdensome? Well then, yeah, of course it's inconvenient. Tough.
So then, go ahead, Susan.
I was gonna say, yes, the answer is yes, but at the same time, are we looking at it through the lens of, is he preparing me for something? Is he You know, what is it that, I mean, of course, examine your heart. Have I done something wrong is always the first go-to. But beyond that, it's like, okay, once I've done that and there isn't anything that I know more to bring to him, then what is it, Lord, that you need to see glorified in this? What are you preparing me for, or for others for, or what purpose could be glorifying to you? It's hard not to think of it just as a burden, though.
Well, look, I commend you guys. I see mature hearts here and the answers to these questions and how we all direct this. I see mature hearts. I like that. That even just the way that you said that, Susan, that was great. Instead of looking at it again through the lens of, well, that was the old burdensome law. Now we don't have to do any of this stuff anymore, or now I can just pray and go up to the front of the church or whatever and have the elders or somebody lay hands on me, and hopefully, poof, we get that, right? Or if that doesn't work, thank God we live here in America. We have this great healthcare system, and you go to the doctor and get your cream or your ointment or whatever it is, whatever treatment, and hopefully that works, right? We know that medicines actually don't really cure anything. They just deal with symptoms so your body can figure out how to cure itself in most cases, right? So, but we have these things. But I guess where I'm going with that is just the maturity to see that this isn't just this like grind of a system that he gave them because they were, backwards, or they were not enlightened or not scientific. People who know me have heard me say this many times. I don't think that we're getting smarter as time goes on. I think humanity is getting dumber the farther that we get away from creation. I'm positive that these people were brilliant, and as they went further back, they were smart people.
I like your question on burdensome, because with not just this requirement, just to put it in a practical sense, if God asks me to do something, if I consider what he's asking me to do burdensome, then that kind of shows where my heart attitude is with the Lord. Do I want to please him, or do I find what he's asking of me to be something that puts me out because I want it my way instead of his way? And I think it all kind of comes down to that. When you start going through that mindset of, Lord, you're making me do all this stuff, then there's something wrong in your heart when you start copying an attitude with him, because he's asking something of you. Do you want to please him, or do you want to please yourself? Okay, God, I'll serve you on my terms, or I'll serve you on your terms, So I think that's a good question, because it's something you can sit there, and when you start to think what the Lord's asking of you is too great, too much, too whatever, or, why do I have to jump through all these hoops, Lord? Then maybe we need to re-examine where our relationship is with him, or what our attitude is of how much do we consider him God? That do we not think he knows better? Do we think we know better?
Well, he's God when we're asking him to do stuff for us.
Yeah.
Right, which is probably 99% of it.
Yeah.
Right? Versus when he says, I need you to go, I want you to, sell your house and move to someplace that you don't know anybody, and go and do my work there, or go be a missionary somewhere, or, serve the poor, or serve the elderly, or the sick, or the infirm, or any of those things.
Or even small
What do we
things,
do about
take
it?
cookies to your neighbor.
Sure.
Well, I don't want to make cookies right now. I mean, it could be from so small to big things, but he's still asking something of you. And he's asking something of them so that he can stay in fellowship with them. So how important is it to you to have him in your midst and to be in fellowship with him?
Right.
No, that's.
Yeah,
I
no,
mean,
so
what that
I mean,
question
put that
asks
lens
is-
on this.
Yeah.
is what we're saying, right, Brad?
Yes, it seems burdensome, but I keep coming back to just one word mentioned earlier that I don't know that we really got to, but it's stigma. Because I feel that before this, if somebody had sores all over their body, they could, I would imagine, be like sent away from camp indefinitely. They're gonna be a pariah. They're gonna have, people could look at them as unclean. This gives them a way out of that. This gives them a way back into the community where people will say, oh, well, not only did he do the things God commanded to do, and therefore now I can see him as clean because God sees him as clean, but he follows the Lord. In what he does in his actions to heal, he follows the Lord. And so that is somebody that I can welcome back into my, house, my community, my whatever. And it gets rid of that stigma. And it seems burdensome, but like we've talked about with women after they give birth, that time that they have to be away. Oh, that seems like, they're being shunned and separated and quarantined, but really it's for their own benefit. So they can have that time to heal and to bond with their baby and to do all these things. And so it's, I think, much in the same way when they have these ailments. That it's a way for them to go through these steps, follow the Lord, keep their heart on the Lord through it all, and then be welcome back in the community.
Yeah. Can I tag on to that a little bit? Because I've been thinking about a lot of what you just said, and I think that, I think what we can, if we have the right lens on this, I think we can actually see a really good application of love God, love neighbor, right? Because yes, God is instructing, so part of loving God is obeying him. So if there's this instruction and you have this affliction, then yes, you have to obey and go outside the camp and go through the process, right? But then it's also loving neighbor, because even though I'm agreeing with you, I'm not trying to put a scientific lens on this, but practical reality is that if there's something like this could be a contagious thing, you could spread it. And I think there is a practical reality, because God is actually pretty practical to keep it from spreading. And so instead of, if you try to hide it and then you spread it through all the camp, that's bad news. It's also loving neighbor of I don't know why this happened to me, but I don't want this to spread among everyone else. And so it's this love neighbor aspect. And also with this, that God is so merciful that he does provide a way back. Because again, one of the things that the Torah shows us is that the God of Israel is categorically different than all other gods. In any other culture, you have a person with burns all over their body, it's like they have done something really bad to offend the gods. They're done. They're probably, in some cases, they probably kill them. But God's there's a restoration process. And at the same time, I think that we don't see the side of it, because this is talking about that all of this instruction is about whether or not you can enter into the tabernacle and be in the presence of God. So there's a lot of angles of this that we're not seeing. So we're not seeing what responsibility and what care comes from the rest of the people around them. As far as if these people are outside the camp, how are they getting food? Somebody's probably bringing it out to them, and they may have to stay a certain distance away, but it's kind of like when I had COVID, somebody dropped food off on my porch for me, but there's care, so there's still community care, and I think that's one of the things that we can keep in mind as we read through some of these instructions too, is that yes, there's instruction because God is very specific about the requirements for entering into his presence and entering into the tabernacle, but there's also this communal element. And I think that's part of what gets us to, is we're so individual and we're so personal that I shouldn't have to share any personal information with anyone if I don't want to. Whereas this is really requiring some really quite public information, personal information about a lot of different things. And again, yes, I think there's stigma with some of this, but I think it's also as you get further on into in chapter 15, a lot of the things that, as we've kind of mentioned earlier, a lot of these things that make you unclean are normal life things, and even the woman having a baby and stuff. And also just to point out, the part of this, the requirement of the sacrifices after she has a baby is a sin offering. And Tom has talked about before, sin and purification offering, even though sin and unclean are not exactly the same thing, the offerings are still really similar. And it's just because these bodily fluids, and often there's blood involved and there's life in the blood, and so it's just the way that you kind of come back into right order with the Lord. It's just the way that he's kind of set that up. So I think that's a hard thing too, is that we're so used to being so individual and so like my personal information is mine and I don't have to share it with anybody, that really here it's like, and again, it's deference for the community. It's like if you're unclean, you have to have this willingness to make that known so that someone else can keep their clean state if they're going to go into the presence of the Lord. It's that love God, love neighbor playing out in that aspect as well, I think.
We also saw that pronouncement of clean, because after Yeshua healed the men with leprosy, go back to the priest and present yourself. And once the priest proclaimed them clean, I mean, it removed all stigma, it removed all of that. They were clean. So that, again, that's like a community thing of nobody can point a finger anymore because you've been proclaimed clean. And so that kind of shows that whole community dynamic, which again, here in the US, we've lost so much of that community dynamic. But, you know, they had a way to remove, even though this person had gone through all of this, it's done now, the priests have proclaimed you clean, you know, everything's good. And so, and I do like the fact that you mentioned sin offering / purification offering, because a lot of this, it's these people didn't sin, but they need to be purified.
Well, again, it makes my heart glad that I see from this group that our hearts are to see God's goodness in all this, to see past just the plain words on the page, that, like I said, if you don't know him and if you don't know this, seem burdensome, and again, there would be stigmas attached, and it's easy to look at it from the negative side of things rather than looking at it from the positive side of things. I think there's also some really deep spiritual truths that we've hit on too. The environment, like my mom was saying, you know, the fact that we're, you know, how do we translate that into here now? You know, the world around us, how are we affected by it? Spiritually, how are we affected by it? Physically, how are we affected by it? Because I don't separate the two really. What's going on in the invisible has a direct correlation to what's happening in the visible and vice versa. So, yeah. That is, overall, just, you know, whatever, didn't get to all the questions, but that was, my goal was I wanted us to see, again, God's goodness in this, and go past just, you know, the law is bad, grace good, Old Testament negative, New Testament positive. It's one book. And like you had brought up, even Yeshua, right? He didn't say, oh, well, I'm doing a totally new thing. You don't have to bother showing yourself to the priest. It's all good. I've said you're clean. No, he still commanded them to keep the law, right?
Because it wasn't meant to be oppressive.
Right. Yeah. Any other questions? Comments?
Simple comment. I used to drink soy milk, totally believed that soy milk was good for me. Then a time came when my hands became very painful, and continued to drink the soy milk, didn't know why my hands were painful. They hurt so bad I couldn't make a fist. And you know, I love to work with my hands, I do all kinds of things. I need my hands to be flexible and all that. So I said, Lord, what is going on? Why are my hands hurting? And prayed that little prayer, sensed, stop the soy milk. Stop the soy milk. I stopped drinking the soy milk. My hands stopped hurting. So I look at that as a little miracle. Something was going on in my body. I wasn't used to it. I was doing the soy milk for my health. But actually, because the soy today is not pure, it has contaminants in it, it was harming my body. And it demonstrated in that way. I went to my father, I cried out, I asked him why. I didn't think he was doing it, but I asked him why. And I sensed the soy. Did he say, should I say, he told me? Yeah, he did tell me. Because it came to my mind that what was hurting me was the soy. I stopped it, the pain went away. Is that a miracle? Yeah, it is. It means that when we are in any kind of suffering, the first person we should go to is Abba and ask him why. I have done prayers of specific things, specifically that moment answered. When there is just something that happens in the spirit, when you are going to the Lord with a problem, Ruach Adonai is involved. And if you pray the right prayer, not the right prayer, but use the right words in your supplication before God, Holy Spirit comes in and heaven touches earth and it happens. So everything we experience is a learning process. And it's just an opportunity to communicate with your Creator.
It's the journey, right? He cares about the journey. All I can say is I'm glad you didn't keep that stuff in the house when we were kids. That it was good old-fashioned thick cow milk with my Cheerios in the morning.
Well, I gave you what you liked.
I could have told you soy milk was bad.
Yeah, I want to a little bit put thoughts, whoever wants to take those thoughts. You know, when the corona happened, we heard that doctors get sick with that, celebrities, presidents, and we know that they can get sick and be like everybody else. I never heard or read that no priest, no famous feature in the Bible was with leprosy or was contaminated with something. They're always like, they are the ones that are pure, they don't sin, and they don't get this disease, and the rest of them have to be quarantined and stuff like that. And in fact, I'm sure that if they got contaminated with leprosy, sick with leprosy, they found a way not to be published and to hide it away so they can still stay pure with the society there.
Yeah.
So I think it's unfair that the reader will hear one side of the situation there.
That's why we talk about it here.
But
right? We could bring out all the sides.
But we do know that Moses was afflicted. He's the most famous of all. So we do know that he had it at one point. And we also know that Miriam did. And we know which king was it? Which king was it that had it for his whole life?
Was he quarantined?
There's a king that had it for the rest of his life.
Yeah, that's
And they would have,
Yes.
so when Moses and Miriam had it, we hadn't been given the Torah, so we don't know exactly what they had, because they hadn't been given the law yet. So we don't know what the instruction was yet, because it's progressive revelation, right? So we don't know, but the king that was, he would have been treated that way. He would have been he would have been allowed to, we know he wasn't allowed to go into the holy place. He wasn't allowed to go into the temple the rest of his life.
Quarantined like everybody else?
Yeah. And even the
Yeah.
priest, if the priest goes out to see someone who has it and they still, like, and they're not, it's not healed, that's like, cause right, there's like these levels, right? You go see it and the priest says, okay, you have to go out. Well, the priest has just been in contact with it, so they're unclean until evening. So they're like, they don't lay out the, like, I mean, we'd never be able to finish reading the Torah if they said, this is what happens in every single situation. But they're not exempt from it. And the priests have higher requirements than anyone else because they're going further in. The high priest is going into the only once a year, one Holy of Holies. But the rest of the priests are going into the inner court. So they have higher requirements than everyone else. So they would have been subject to this.
They have to have all the pinky toys.
The priests do, but that's actually I don't know that there's instruction in Torah that says the common person can't have any physical, like something like that, and be able to go in, because they can only go into the outer court in any way. But the priests do have to can't have any physical.
You know, for Yeshua in the New Testament, it would be much easier to wash the feet of those who don't have pinky toes. Less work.
There you go. There you go.
See, Nassim is a very justice-oriented
Yes,
person.
yes.
And he has a strong aversion to rules for thee but not me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure.
Nassim doesn't like that. If he detects or feels like there's something that's unjust or unfair going on personally, it works on him, it offends him, and until he has a chance to work through it, it sits on him. I love that man.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, I don't know, all this, it's true. I think, again, God is not looking for ways to keep us away from him.
Right.
It's, again, I don't want us to see, and I know this isn't this group, but that, Yeshua was God in fully open arms, but the Old Testament guy, he was trying to find ways to keep us away. It isn't true, and it isn't what we should be seeing in our reading of this. If we're seeing that, then it's check your heart, right? Which is where we've ended up with all this, right? Check your heart and see where.
He was doing the opposite. He was trying to find ways to let you draw near to him.
Yeah. He's not looking for ways to exclude people, but it's his way or the highway.
Mm-hmm.
They're on his terms, not our terms, and that hasn't changed. If anybody out there watches this, if you're thinking that's changed, I would challenge you to re-examine all of that, or come and have a conversation about it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, did you stop?
I haven't stopped it yet, but are we good?